Well, Dana, first of all, thank you for everything that you've done and everything that you've done on this show over the past transformative year. I think it's been a year of revelations. You know, if you think back to the main comparison that I reached for and that so many other people reached for on October 7th, 2023, the obvious comparison, of course, was to 9/11. You know, liberal democracy is attacked by a group of jihadi terrorists who butcher and maim and murder and slaughter, and in the case of Israel, so rape. The difference, of course, was in the aftermath. On September 12th, 2001, it would have been impossible to imagine young people crowding the cities across the West, including here in America, waving the flags of Hamas and Hezbollah and shouting glory to the martyrs and globalize the Intifada. It would have been absolutely unthinkable. And everyone would have responded to that with shock and horror. But what has happened on October 8th, 2023, and every single day since then, including today, when the streets of this city are going to be flooded, and this is an allusion to the Al-Aqsa flood, which is what Hamas called the attacks of October 7th, 2023, to flood the city to celebrate what happened on this day.
Now, that's such a notable attempt to create an equivalence between the reactions of Americans to September 11th, the actual day or two that followed, and the American reaction to an attack on Israel, because she's assuming these two countries are the same. That Americans have the obligation to look at an attack on their country, the United States, on September 11th, in exactly the same way, with the same exact emotional response, as they're supposed to look at this country on the other side of the world that has nothing to do with them other than they're forced to finance its military and arm its wars, that they're supposed to react in exactly the same way to the attack on Israel, even though they're Americans. Now, there were plenty of American dissidents, even in the aftermath of September 11th, who tried to counter this propaganda about how we were just this peaceful country out of nowhere who was attacked. Noam Chomsky actually wrote one of his most popular books very quickly, putting the 9/11 attack in context, and it went to the bestseller list of the New York Times for weeks and weeks because it was one of the only attempts to counter that propagandist narrative. So there was dissent, and of course there was dissent throughout the next year as Guantanamo and torture and rendition, and then finally the war in Iraq began emerging out of this reaction to 9/11, and people began dissenting very strongly. Huge amounts of protests in the streets against the United States and the UK and their attempt to invade Iraq, or huge amounts of protest against the American government for Guantanamo and torture and rendition and so much else of what was done. Maybe there was like a week or two of unity, but very quickly the Patriot Act was introduced, and then people started questioning very, very aggressively whether or not what our government was doing was the right thing. Now, obviously, people in the United States are not going to react emotionally to an attack on Israel the same way they're going to react to an attack on their own country. And Bari Weiss's expectation that they will, or her belief that they should, reflects what is her mindset. But in this case, and she mentioned October 8th, by October 8th, the Israeli bombing campaign of Gaza had already begun. They were already flattening apartment buildings and mosques and schools. And everyone knew what the Israelis were going to do. They were going to go on a rampage and kill God knows who, what percentage of the Gazan population. And that was what people were protesting against. And the reason they were protesting against that was not because they just started seeing it after October 7th, but because they had seen it for years and years and decades before that. But either way, yes, I'm sorry, Bari Weiss, people who are in the United States have the right to form the opinion that the primary party at fault in the Middle East is Israel. We're allowed to have that view. And millions and millions of people all over the world have that view. In fact, more governments have that view than have the view of Bari Weiss in the world. And people are allowed to identify with Hamas as a resistance group that was trying to enter Israel as a way of breaking out what essentially has become an open-air prison. Obviously, There's no defense of targeting civilians, just like there's not when Israel does it. But to try and create this equivalence between the unity, the national unity that emerged after September 11th among Americans for an attack on their country, and the fact that there were Americans who immediately began protesting what they knew was going to be the completely unhinged and sociopathic destruction of Gaza by Israel, is so reflective of how so many pro-Israel fanatics think that they see no distinction between the United States and Israel.
And so the world has changed, not just because this was the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, and it was, not just because it happened inside of the sovereign nation of Israel and made Israelis feel vulnerable in a way that they thought was impossible since the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948.
Maybe that's a problem. Since 1948, the Israelis have continuously and repeatedly bombed their neighbors and invaded their neighbors and killed huge numbers of civilian people. So the idea that Israel thought, oh, we're never going to be subject to the things we're imposing on other countries, perhaps was part of the problem. I think it was part of the problem with the United States as well. Yeah, we can go all over the world and bomb whoever we want and control every other country and put people in underground CIA black sites of torture and kidnap them off the streets, because what is anyone going to do to us? We're the ones who bring violence to other countries. We're not the country that gets violence brought to us. And 9/11 was a big wake-up call that actually you can't go around the world doing that and not expect what the CIA calls blowback. And this Israeli entitlement that they have the right to just bomb and blockade and kill at immense amounts, which they were doing before October 7th, and think that their country is supposed to somehow be immune to the things that they were imposing on other people for decades, I think is part of the problem.
But it has transformed, I think, the West, because what we have seen is that we live among people, some of our neighbors, some of our college professors, some of our graduate students, some Broadway producers. I was rewatching some videos. They went out and tore down posters of these innocent people, posters of babies and children and women, some of whom are still being held by Hamas. You would never imagine someone tearing down a poster of a lost cat or a lost dog, and yet here they were tearing down posters of human beings. And so, as I sit here on, I can't believe it's been a year. And in certain ways, it's really felt like one long day because we're living inside of the aftermath of it. And so it's impossible to sort of offer like an elegy for something that's still unfolding. But as I'm sitting here talking to you, I'm thinking, of course, of the victims that you guys just showed on the screen. I'm thinking of the hostages that are still being held there. But I'm also thinking of the war for civilization, because I think it's no more and no less than that. And I think that that is what began on October 7th and what is still unfolding today.
I have 100 questions.
So this is really the crux of it. You notice there she said what she's thinking about and expressing compassion for. The victims on October 7th, the Israelis who felt afraid, the Israeli hostages who were taken. And the primary Israeli propaganda has always tried to be that Israel fights the same enemies that threaten the United States, as though Hezbollah and Hamas pose any threat whatsoever to the United States. But the fact that she's thinking about the 1,100 people in Israel who were killed on that day, she's thinking about the 300 hostages who were taken, the 100 or so that are left. She's thinking about this broader attempt to convince the West that Israel is fighting our war. You know what she's not thinking about? Ever. And that's why it was omitted from what she said. And this is very exemplary. Like I said, we could have chosen 1,000 interviews like this. What she's not thinking about is what was being shown on the screen as she spoke, which was rubble on October 8th from Gaza. And then the far, 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 far greater number of people who have been killed in Gaza by Israeli forces and Israeli bombs that the U.S. provides since October 8th, since October 7th. That isn't anything she's thinking about at all. Or the people who are now internally displaced in Gaza, which is 90% of the population, the 25% of the Lebanese population that's displaced, the 2,000 people in Lebanon who have been killed, as we've seen apartment buildings and mosques detonated and exploded in Beirut, because Bari Weiss and so many people like her believe that the value of a Jewish life is so much greater than the value of the Arab life or the Muslim life, even the innocent among them.